Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Ipshita Chanda and I teach comparative literature at Jadavpur University. Today we will be talking about African and Caribbean literatures, the background being colonization and decolonization, the historical processes. The aim of this module is to introduce the student to the phenomenon of slavery and colonization and link these to the politics of colonial rule and decolonization. These processes are directly related to the anti-colonial nationalist movements on the African continent and in the African diaspora, thus creating the context of location of African and Caribbean literatures in Europhone languages, of which Anglophone African literatures is a part. The importance of this section to the course as a whole is that the student will understand the literatures written in Africa and in the diaspora in the English language by locating the texts in their milieu. This module will attempt to historicize that milieu and explain the conditions for the formation of the modern map of Africa, as well as introduce the student to the politics and society of a colony in its struggle for independence. This provides the material out of which the texts that you will read in this section are fashioned. So the student is encouraged to read all these modules extensively and refer to them throughout the course. The first thing we do is look at the history of the word colonization. In 1888, Henry Morgan Stanley crossed the Congo River, which runs through the center of Africa. He called the account of his journey "In Darkest Africa." By the turn of the century, huge corporations whose mission is described in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness were flourishing in Europe. The purpose of these corporations was the exploration of resources in Africa and Asia. Conrad gives us a sense of the far-reaching tentacles of capital controlling the world seated in the heart of Europe, where he locates the heart of darkness, which spreads its so-called civilizing poison across the world. Literally a worldwide search and occupy operation brought in mineral resources and human resources into the ambit of the market of world capital. These could be acquired through movement and then controlled by the colonizer or the capitalist. In some cases, as in England, the colonies came under the rule of the monarchy and elevated the ruler to a position of the emperor with dominion over foreign territories. This led to a hierarchy between the colonizer and the colonized, as the former's culture had been introduced into the colonies as more civilized, modern, international, etc. This was reinterpreted by the colonized people in Africa, who connected the change wrought in pre-colonial societies by imposition of the European structures of rule and social control. Here we study the effects of colonization upon the African continent and in the New World, where Africans were forcibly removed during slavery. We will consider aspects of the phenomenon of colonization that relate to the condition of those parts of Africa and the Caribbean, which were English colonies, relating them to the colonization of India in order to facilitate our understanding through our own experience. Up till now, we have considered the history of colonization, the reasons for colonization, and begun to talk about the responses that were given by the colonized to colonial imposition. The next thing that we consider is the concept of history as it applies to Africa and the African diaspora in detail. In October 1963, H.R. Trevor Roper delivered a series of lectures at the University of Sussex, reprinted in the Listener of November and December, where he declared, and I quote, Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach, but at present, there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. This account implied that Africa did not have a history of its own until civilized Europe penetrated her dark jungles, substantiating the description of the dark continent which began with Henry Stanley Morgan. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart makes a telling comment on the misrepresentation of Africa. At the end of the book, after Okonkwo has hanged himself, causing a crisis in the village of Umuofia, the district magistrate thinks that the story of this one man who stubbornly resisted colonization should find a place in his book, which he had aptly titled Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. First, he thinks that Okonkwo's story should merit perhaps 1 or 2 pages. Then he thinks that there is a lot to say, so he cuts it down to a single paragraph. The irony of the entire situation is that Chinua Achebe has just written a book which covers more than 100 pages about this same story, while the English colonizer thinks that it is important only to deserve not more than a few lines. The history of Africa is emblematic of the conflict waged over sign systems by 2 opposing parties. In the case of societies once colonized, this conflict is between the local people who have gained independence through using recognizable signs common to a group not necessarily of the same cultural nationality. The post-colonial nation, built in imitation of Europe, is a political and affective construct. Its function as a distinguishing mark in the international context provides a kernel around which people can construct both themselves and a community. The specific form of colonization and the history of the colonizing power decide the exact contours of the erstwhile colony's evolution into a nation through contact with colonial administrative and cultural policies. Next, we will look at how this works in the Caribbean, which is part of the African diaspora. The earliest written history of the Caribbean are European reports, which began with the coming of the colonizers and record achievements of the society without mentioning the presence of the colonized, written from an European perspective, similar to that of Trevor Roper on African history, which we have just discussed. Now, while the English travel writer Froude described the Caribbean as a sterile mimicry of Europe, V.S. Naipaul, an Indo-Caribbean writer, described this loss of history as nihilistic. Naipaul said, history is built around the achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies. Now, this hidden or erased history, according to Wilson, is told by the islanders and held in common by all. But there is no documentary evidence for this Caribbean history because most of it is orally recorded. Now, to the violence of the erasure of this history is added an epistemic violence and a loss evident in the prohibitions on African cultural expressions, as we will see when we look at African theatre, that all the existing performance traditions were forcibly and by law outlawed by the British colonizers. The colonizers imposed their own language upon the islanders as they had done in Africa, and school education in both the Caribbean and in Africa was concentrated on the disciplines of history and literature, which endorsed the superiority of the colonizers and made their perspective dominant. Hence, Caribbean writers as diverse as Vic Reed, Junot Dias, Norbese Philip, and Erna Broadbere, Earl Lovelace, and Kay Miller share a collective commitment to rehumanize and indigenize those subjects who have been denied a relationship to the past based on their own genealogy, and they were forcibly torn from their homes and moved to the Caribbean colonies. In response, Derek Walcott, the Nobel Prize winning dramatist from the Caribbean, insists, and I quote, on the supremacy of imagination over history. This has been named as the poeticist tradition of history. So, we have now covered the concept of history as it was propagated by the colonizers in Africa and in the Caribbean, and the responses and resistance that came from the colonized Africans and the Caribbean people. Now we are going to look at the forms of colonization. The main one which we will focus on is cultural colonization. The cultural policy of the British colonizers depended upon their perception of the colony. At the start of colonial rule in India, the policy of cultural colonization was outlined by Thomas Babington Macaulay in his Minute on Education dated 1835, which proclaimed that, and I quote, "We must at present do our best to form a class which may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and opinions, in morals and in intellect." This lesson from India was first tested by the government in India and then transferred to the colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean. The colonizers had thus a double aim, which was described as philanthropy at 5% or Christianity and commerce, which made the colonizers claim that they were bringing to a historyless, scriptless, barbaric, uncivilized people the gift of Christianity and Western civilization. And it also covered their real aim in being in the colonies, which was economic exploitation. The effects of Christianity on the colonized can be seen in Chinua Achebe's novels, as well as novels like Mugo Gatheru's Child of Two Worlds. This cultural colonization was parallel with the actual political colonization that was described as the Scramble for Africa, which is what we look at next. The demands of capital set up the triangular trade, transporting slaves to the Caribbean and the New World. This forced movement of African people from the continent across southern parts of America was instrumental in capital formation. Africa was exploited for all its resources, human and non-human. But the very lucrative colonial enterprise also rested on a delicate balance between cost and expenditure. Once, many European nations had acquired land in Africa and Asia through means as diverse as war and through the dowry of kings. The necessity of protecting each nation's right to access the natural resources that it had annexed led to a collective meeting in the last decade of the 19th century, sponsored by the ruler of Belgium, King Leopold, and presided over by his minister Bismarck. At this meeting, which was known as the Scramble for Africa, there were a series of these meetings at Berlin, where all the colonial powers sent their representatives and sat at a table with a map of Africa, partitioning their own respective interests from one another. It is to be noted that not a single African was present at the Berlin conferences, and no Africans had anything to say about the way in which their land and their continent was being partitioned by the colonizers. The introduction of European languages and the Roman script happened in Africa according to the colonial power that ruled that part of the country. So, the English, the French, and the Portuguese had their own areas in which English, French, and Portuguese were taught as languages. Now, these areas are known as the Anglophone, the Francophone, and the Lusophone areas. The cultural policy influenced not only the education of in the colonies, but the entire cultural lives of the colonized. Now we go into the kinds of colonization that was practiced apart from the cultural. And the first thing that we look at is settler colonization, which could be found in areas which were conducive to large agricultural farming. One of these areas was Kenya. Settler colonization refers to the settling of the colonizer in the land of the colonized, especially and mostly for plantation agriculture, for which labor was cheaply available from among the colonized. These areas covered northern Rhodesia, which is now known as Zambia, Kenya, Nyasaland, now known as Malawi, southern Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. The Crown Lands Ordinances in the British protectorates of Africa dispossessed the native farmers of their land, taking everything in the name of the Crown, because the natives did not have any title deeds to their land. In southern Africa, the spirit of pioneering seemed paramount, for the most inhospitable climates were chosen for the ultimate profit they could yield. Labor was available cheaply, thus the return of the land was a demand made by the colonized in these specific areas. One historical instance of armed militancy for decolonization was the Mau Mau War for Land and Freedom that was fought by the guerrillas in Kenya. During the second half of the 17th century, colonialism was linked to mercantilism, based on establishing gold and silver reserves and a favorable trade balance, and in the British and French possessions in particular, to sugar and coffee plantations using slave labor imported from West Africa. The object of each of these imperial systems was to exact profits from the systems of trade in sugar, slaves, manufactured goods. Mercantilism was most fully expressed in what is referred to as the triangular and quadrilateral trades. In their most complicated form, these linked Europe, West Africa, and North and South America, and the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States in reciprocal commerce, largely for the benefit of the British, French, and the Portuguese. Now that the British had acquired their colonial possessions, we should turn to look at what they did with them, that is, how they actually governed them. And British colonial rule is something which is familiar to us as Indians, because the same policy that was tested in India proved to be fruitful and was tested again and again across the Anglophone colonies of the world, Africa being the first instance. This colonial policy was known as indirect rule. The largest application of indirect rule, as we have already stated, was in India. It was seen to work under the East India Company's system of subsidiary alliances in the Indian subcontinent. The ideological underpinnings, as well as the practical application of indirect rule in Kenya and Nigeria, is usually traced to the work of Lord Frederick Lugard, who was High Commissioner of the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria from 1899 to 1906. Lugard instituted a system whereby external military and tax control was operated by the British, while almost every other aspect of life was left to local pre-British aristocracies who may have sided with the British during or after the conquest. The theory behind this solution to a very practical problem of domination by a tiny group of foreigners of huge populations is laid out in Lugard's influential work called The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. Since this policy was applied across the Caribbean, there is naturally a relation between the policies in Anglophone Africa and in the Anglophone Caribbean areas. The region shares a tumultuous history of colonization, plantation slavery, indentured labor, and finally independence. Yet, it is not a monolithic history. Even when different territories experienced similar events, they did so on very different timetables, and often what they experienced differed substantially. People from all the continents in the world formed the basic demographic of the Caribbean. Despite the contribution made by the Asians to the common culture of the Caribbean, the basis of Caribbean society is the Black or Afro-Caribbean population, which, as the Jamaican scholar and cultural leader Rex Nettleford has written, was central to the dynamic process of adjustment, rejection, renewal, and innovation. The products of these cultural processes are what constitutes the mandates for a national cultural expression. Now, there are some broad differences between colonization in Africa and colonization in the Caribbean. The main difference is that those who were colonized in Africa remained at home while the colonizers came to their lands, while those who were taken to the Caribbean as slaves were forcibly torn from their homes, their communities, their language, and their families, and forced to settle in a land which they had never been to before, amongst people who looked like them because they were all slaves from Africa, but belonged to the many different communities and nationalities that there are across Africa. So often when the slaves were brought to the Caribbean, they did not know each other's language, even though the white colonizer could not tell apart one African nationality from the other. Now, even though enslaved Africans came from all parts of the continent and did not share a common culture, when they came to the Caribbean, they were forced into a common situation of slavery. And so they had a common oppressor, a common exploiter, and a common enemy, which was the colonizer. So despite the diverse cultures of Africa that the slaves came from, when they arrived in the Caribbean, all these diversities that they brought with them amalgamated together and formed what we now understand as the Afro-Caribbean culture. Now, we have seen thus far how colonies were established in Africa, what were the policies followed by the British there, and how these policies were influenced by the British experience of colonization in India. Further, we have looked at how these same policies were transferred to the Caribbean by the English colonizers. And the crucial difference that we have noticed is that slavery marks the Caribbean as different from the Africans. And so there is a distinct culture of the African diaspora, even though that culture is rooted in mainland Africa. And both these cultures are linked to the history of colonization, capitalism, and racism, whereas in the Caribbean, the additional factor that we have to take into account is slavery. Now we will look at the response, the political response of the colonized to the colonizing factor. And the main political response was nationalism. Now, as we have discussed, Anglophone refers to the use of the English language in the colonies of the British. This indicates that the commonality of language and literature actually brought together diverse groups of people both in Africa and in the Caribbean. It also gave them a common opposition to a common enemy, the colonizer, who also ironically used that same language to colonize them. Now, as Caliban says in Shakespeare's The Tempest, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is that I know how to curse." And nationalism in the Anglophone areas began on the basis of a common language. All the African nationalities, as we have discussed, did not have a common language. By introducing English, a commonality was forged between them, and they could use this common tool against their common enemy. Linguistic and political nationalism were therefore very closely tied together. The acquisition of English for various means to answer the colonizer in his own tongue, to gain the status derived from knowing the colonizer's language, the ability to turn the language against its imposer. All these were aims espoused by different African thinkers in their nationalist response to the presence of the English and the English language as civilizing vehicles in their educational systems, and through that into the culture resulting from colonial contact. The idea of nationalism, introduced into the colonies as a result of contact with liberal humanistic education in the English language, made the first generation of nationalists educated in the British system, often traveling to the mother country and coming in contact with that culture, to espouse the values that they had learned there. However, the most difficult thing that they encountered once they came back to their own country was those very values which the English held up in their own land were denied. Those very rights which the English exercised in their own land were denied to the colonized in the colonies. And this created the basis of the budding nationalist movements against the colonizer by the colonized. Another important factor which influenced the history of decolonization in Africa particularly was the experience of India. The experience of India had an effect not only on the colonized but also on the colonizers. The colonized tried to emulate the example of the Indian nationalists in their struggle for freedom against the British. Apart from linguistic and political nationalism, there was also militant nationalism, about which we have talked earlier when we referred to the Mau Mau guerrillas in Kenya. Militant nationalism, as we have noted, happened mostly in areas where the colonizers settled, like in Kenya and Tanzania. The struggle in these areas focused not only on the departure of the British, but also on the reallocation of land to the peasants, that land which was taken away by the Crown Lands Ordinance during colonization. Now, we have traveled through the process of colonization and the process of the establishment of a resistance to colonization. What we look at next is the process of decolonization and what happened after decolonization. Now, the withdrawal of the colonizers from their areas of influence in the colonies was the result of local nationalist movements, but also when the colonizers began to feel that holding on to their colonial possessions was no longer profitable, they decided to move out. This process of decolonization depended upon the nature of colonial rule and policy. In the English colonies, liberal democracy and the parliamentary form of government with political parties ensured that the economic and social control remained in the hands of the British educated leaders. Besides, no fundamental change occurred in the economic organization of the colony. According to Richard Haley, the British policy of decolonization was the process of coming to terms with the middle class leadership of the colony by transferring political and ceremonial power without economic reorganization. Haley called this the Indian dimension, the experience of India, to which we have referred earlier. Colonization shaped a form of economic paternalism, which continued following the withdrawal of the European powers from the colonies in the aftermath of the Second World War. For example, the British continued to apply existing and past international economic arrangements with the formerly colonized countries, and so maintained colonial control over the modes of production despite being foreign nationals. The Commonwealth, which was set up by the British, served to legitimize the economic system of colonialism long after decolonization. African thinkers like the Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, coined the term neocolonialism to describe this situation. This process of colonization, resistance, and decolonization led to several ideological and political positions taken across the colonies, both in the African continent and in the Caribbean, by various thinkers. So this section is called Africa in the World, and here we are going to consider the different positions taken by African thinkers on the process of decolonization and their views on what would follow next. The first thing we consider is nationalism and Creolization, also known as Negritude. There is a specific line of descent that links contemporary philosophers of transnationalism, such as Edward Glissant, the Creolists, and Antonio Benitez Rojo, to Frantz Fanon, the Martinican prophet of nationalism. Fanon dismantles romantic assumptions concerning national identity. He says that whereas the traditional European idea of nation implied a common and homogeneous sense of history, the traditional culture of the past is open to reinterpretation rather than being an inert given. He grounds a successful national consciousness in dynamic rather than ossified oral traditions. However, a challenge to even dynamic nationalism is posed by the philosophy of Negritude, arising from the work of another Martinican philosopher and poet, Aimé Césaire. Nègre is the word for black in French, and the celebration of blackness as complementary to whiteness, the positive valuation of black as necessary to complete civilization, is characteristic of the African continental variety of negritude professed by the first president of Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor. But Aimé Césaire, located in the Caribbean, is not so intent on the complementarity between black and white. Rather, his position is radically opposite. Thus, Césaire professes an independent standard for black civilization, which he names negritude, and this standard is defined negatively against the white supremacist views. This prompts Edward Glissant to formulate his Poetics of the Rhizome, saying that there is not a single root to which Caribbean culture can be traced, by which he means that Caribbean people come from all over the world due to slavery, as we have discussed, and so they have roots in many places, and therefore he metaphorically calls this collective rootedness rhizomatic rather than a single root. Another ideology which was espoused mainly by the mainland Africans was Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is the understanding of oneself as connected to others of African descent in other sites through a shared origin and history of enslavement or colonization. This ideal is criticized by Fanon, who saw as inherently flawed the continent-wide approach of Pan-Africanists of his time and their promotion of a transnational black culture that failed to account for the specificities of the different African communities and their own cultures. Now, the basis of nationalism in the Caribbean, given the rhizomatic nature of the cultures of the Caribbean, is transnationalism rather than nationalism in the singular. Given its history, the Caribbean has never been inhabited by a single race from the moment of the European incursion. Transnationalism is a crucial characteristic of the Caribbean, inhabited by many nations with a common African heritage based on both the experience of slavery and the memory of the imagined home on the continent. In these conditions, the actual political boundaries of the nations do not obstruct the networks of people of African descent across so-called national borders. In this module, we have looked at the concept of colonization historically and culturally from the point of view of the colonized in the African continent and from the point of view of the African diaspora in the Caribbeans. We have considered the policies of colonization adopted by the British colonizer and the background which is familiar to us regarding the same policies that they adopted in India and then spread across their colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean. We have also looked at the differences in the conditions and the histories in Africa and in the Caribbean and tried to ground the different forms of nationalism and the different movements for decolonization that arose in both these areas.